there is also, from what I understand, serious discussion going on in some of the European NATO headquarters about extending a no-fly zone into Ukraine. Now, this would not be necessarily a unique thing. I was in Iraq in 1991 when NATO imposed a no-fly zone of Saddam Hussein's Iraqi fighter jets that were trying to kill the Kurdish race off. That worked very effectively and the Kurds were saved. And then only last year, British and French jets knocked down Iranian drones and missiles fired at Israel's civilians. So there is precedent here. And I think there is a growing body of thought that actually this is something that NATO should do. There is huge concern that it would mean that NATO jets and Russian jets coming up against each other. But I think this is comments by people who don't really understand the situation. The Russian Air Force, to me, is pretty much a spent entity. We have seen very little Russian fighter jet activity in Ukraine, and we know that Russian fighter jets, when they come up against stealth jets like the F-35s, are no match for them at all. And speaking to British fighter pilots and people expert in this area say that actually the F-35 jets are also not concerned by Russian air defense like the S-400s, as was demonstrated when the Americans attacked Iranian nuclear sites earlier on this year. So I think in practical terms, NATO could produce a very effective no-fly zone, that is to prevent Russian drones and missiles hitting civilian targets, which seems to be the main aim of the Russians at the moment, to attack civilians. And if that was in place, then we know that Russia is actually going backwards in a lot of areas in the front line, in the Donbass, around Petrovsk and elsewhere at the moment. And, that is more likely to get Putin to the negotiation table, I expect, than any amount of sanctions or any amount of hot air coming out of Western capitals or Washington, D.C.
But do you expect the US administration to also back this idea of a no-fly zone over Ukraine? Because there have been only discussions of about post-war security guarantees for Ukraine, but not about the possibility of closing Ukrainian sky before the fighting stops.
I think most analysts like myself, and I think most people looking at this, are assuming that the Americans would not be involved in a European no-fly zone. What we are assuming is that American intelligence would still be available. And President Trump has suggested that that would be the case. And European NATO fighter jets would require American intelligence to allow them to make sure that they can pick up these missiles and drones as early as possible and to neutralize them, shoot them down before they hit their target. So I think the working assumption is that the American fighter jets wouldn't be involved in any no-fly zone, but their intelligence support would be. And as you say, at the moment, there is only an American military guarantee once we have a ceasefire. And this no-fly zone would be before a ceasefire, I expect, but we were hoping it would be a catalyst leading to a ceasefire because, the Russians and particularly Putin would realize that they were really, to use the chess vernacular, would be in checkmate, as it were.
Do you expect Vladimir Putin to conduct another so-called hybrid attack on NATO countries or another drone attack against Poland or other NATO members in the nearest future?
Yes, I think the assumption is absolutely the Russians will carry on their activity. We know that they're conducting a lot of cyber attacks on various targets in Europe and elsewhere. We know that they're doing a number of sabotage attacks using their security service, their secret services. A lot had been stopped and interdicted, but this is the way the Russians operate. So I think the assumption is they will keep doing that, and they will keep doing that until they're convinced that NATO will react demonstrably against them. Which is why it was so important that NATO did shoot down these Russian drones and missiles that were fired at Poland. But I think this is only the first shot, if you like, in this, and one expects the Russians to keep up the pressure and the attacks on NATO countries in Europe until there is some sort of ceasefire and peace deal being negotiated.
Do you expect a ceasefire or any kind of peace deal to be reached this year or at the beginning of next year? What is your assessment of the current stage of so-called negotiations between US administration, Ukrainians and Russians?
Well, I think at the moment that there is no prospect at all. President Putin has shown very clearly since the Alaska summit that he has no interest in peace at all, and is cracking on. And the attacks we've talked about really personify that position. I think the ambiguity coming out of the US in particular and some NATO countries have really exacerbated this and made it worse. It'll be very interesting to see what President Trump says while he's in the UK. This is a key aim of the British government, to try and get Trump to get off the fence, as it were, and be more proactive in trying to get Putin to the peace table, because his Alaska summit and his meeting of European leaders shortly after that in Washington so far have really come to nothing. In fact, Putin has actually upped his activity, and we've seen more attacks in Ukraine since the Alaska summit than really we've seen before the summit. So it had a negative effect, if you like. But it seems clear that a lot of the cards sit with President Trump at the moment, and what he decides to do. Allied to that, I think European countries are showing a much more unified front now. But I think we need to go a stage further, and a real demonstration of European NATO military power would be to provide a no-fly zone against civilian targets in Ukraine. I know the technical details have been discussed about this in military headquarters around Europe, but whether European politicians have the guts and the gumption to be able to put this in place, is not clear at the moment. We shall see.
You just also mentioned about President Trump. President Trump on Saturday said that he will impose further sanctions on Russia only if all NATO countries place high tariffs on China and stop buying Russian oil. Is this a really new strategic move, or just an excuse to avoid placing sanctions? Because many experts say that this condition is almost certain not to be met, because such countries like Hungary and other European members of NATO, and also like Turkey, they are not going to stop buying Russian oil.
Yes, this is a very strange statement coming out of the White House. It's one can see that most European countries might comply, certainly on the Russian oil perspective. But as you say, countries like Turkey and Hungary and some of the other European countries are highly unlikely to stop buying what is in effect very, very cheap hydrocarbons, which are probably helping their economy. And when it comes to tariffs on China, again, there is not the animosity, I think, in Europe between China that there is between the US and China. The US and China are the world's two superpowers who are trying to vie for position as the leading sort of commercial and business countries in the world. European countries that are just not involved in that. So yeah, you can't. I wouldn't expect, and I doubt that we'll see European countries putting huge tariffs on China. Perhaps if President Trump lifts the tariffs on European countries, then they might comply in some way. But yeah, unfortunately, I think this is a rather crude stalling tactic by President Trump to not sanction the Russians any more than he is at the moment.
Let's also cover some interesting publications about Vladimir Putin's way of life. British newspaper Times reported about the 3 bunkers Vladimir Putin is using to run his country. So Russian dictator Putin is running his country from a series of identical conference rooms, so-called bunkers, according to CIA sources, just to prevent anyone around the globe, prevent any country from identifying his locations. That's why he is running his country from 3 identical bunkers around Russia. What does this say about Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think Putin is fixated by his own security and realizes that he is in the crosshairs, if you like, of probably an awful lot of people. And, you know, they're not all outside Russia. I'm sure there are people in Russia who would like to see the end of Putin for all the destruction that he's done and the destruction he's done to the Russian economy. So it's very clear that his security is almost his main effort. We've seen a lot of air defense assets removed from the front line protecting soldiers to protect his bunkers and his palaces around Russia. And if I purely put my military and strategic hat on, yeah, it makes a lot of sense to keep moving and going to different places. But the resources required to protect Putin and to keep his bunkers and palaces going are absolutely massive. And Putin might be well protected in his bunkers, but the young soldiers that he's sending to the front line are not protected at all. And by saving his own life, he is probably condemning thousands of young Russian men to death on the front line. So I think it just shows the sort of person that he is. He's very concerned about his own safety, but he has virtually no concern for the lives of the soldiers that he sends to the front line, and actually generally the civilians in Russia whose economy he's destroyed and who are living a pretty miserable life, where he lords it up in great luxuries in his various palaces and luxury houses and apartments around Russia.
What is your assessment of Vladimir Putin's calculus, his thinking right now? What does he plan to do next, and where he is right now on this war? Is he closer to ending this conflict, to reaching any kind of a ceasefire deal, to settle this war?
Well, I think at the moment Putin has no interest in peace. He very clearly stated his aims really over the last 4 or 5 years, and that was the complete subjugation of Ukraine and also the redrawing of the USSR, the Soviet Union boundaries, some of the old states, the Baltic states and elsewhere, that he thinks should be part of the Russian Federation. He said that so clearly to his people that anything less than that would be a failure. And Putin knows that Russian dictators who fail rarely collect their pension. So at the moment, with a still slightly disunited Europe and US, he keeps going. He's trying to persuade the Russian people that he is winning. But the million casualties so far and the thousands every week really don't back that up at all. And people in Russia are beginning to realize it. We also know, quite apart from, he's desperately short of conscripts. We've discussed the thousands of North Koreans that he had. There are now rumors and rumors with, quite strong precedent that actually they're creating battalions of soldiers now with infectious diseases like tuberculosis and HIV because they are so short of people. And when you look at that, it's easy to come to the conclusion the Russian army is culminating. I've already given my assessment. The Russian Air Force is in a pretty poor state. So all he's got now is drones and missiles to keep firing. And of course, if we put a no-fly zone, that will nullify it. But unfortunately, I think Putin at the moment is just going forward because he sees that President Trump isn't prepared to make any decisions and Europe is still sorting itself out. But it's coming to a realization that, we are at a stalemate, if you like, on the front lines. They haven't moved much at all. In fact, Ukraine's made a lot of progress in the last few weeks. But as Putin hunkers down in his various bunkers around Russia, he's pretty safe. It's not going to affect him. But he wants to keep going. He's still, his legacy as the new Tsar of Russia is something that's very important to him. And he doesn't care how many Russians have to die, to realize that. So I'm afraid at the moment, Putin is keeping on going, and it is only European NATO countries and the US who can support Ukraine to try and make sure that Putin realizes that it's completely futile to keep fighting. But at the moment, that we are not at that position. But let's hope that we will soon.
There are many analysts, also many assessment about for how long can Russia sustain this war effort, for example, for 6, 12 months or for another years. What is your assessment on that? For how long can Russia sustain this effort due to also taking into account current economic problems with shortages of human resources and other different issues regarding the Russian army?
Well, unfortunately, President Putin thinks he can keep going, almost forever. It's difficult for us to understand, if this was the other way around, things would have stopped already. But as Putin doesn't care what he does to Russia, he doesn't care if people can't afford to buy basics like potatoes to eat. He doesn't care how many people are killed. Then, when you have that perspective and you have, an autocratic dictator like Putin, he can keep on going and going and going. So, unfortunately, unless we radically change and increase our support to Ukraine, from a Russian perspective, Putin will keep on going. There is a British military intelligence assessment only a few weeks ago that said that to take the Donbass completely, which what Putin says he'll do, will take 4 years and cost another 2 million Russian lives. Now, to most people in the world, that would not be acceptable, but to Putin, it probably is. So I think Putin and Russia will keep going until they're stopped by Ukraine and hopefully by increased support from NATO and the US.